Have you ever felt anxious without knowing exactly why? That constant sense of discomfort, a restlessness that seems to appear out of nowhere, taking over your thoughts and emotions. Anxiety is something we all feel at some point in life, but what many people don't realize is that often it goes beyond an immediate reaction to external situations. In many cases, anxiety has deep roots in our unconscious. In this video, we're going to explore psychoanalysis to understand how anxiety originates within us, often without us being aware of it. Have you ever stopped to think that your anxious reactions might be reflections of unresolved internal conflicts? If you want to understand what's really behind that constant feeling, stay with us, because today we're going to discover how psychoanalysis can shed light on the origins of your anxiety and help you find a way to deal with it more consciously and healthily. Anxiety is an emotion we all experience at some point in life. It's a natural response of the body to stressful situations or challenges. At its core, anxiety prepares our body and mind to face what's coming. This alert mechanism helps us be more aware and ready to deal with danger or opportunity. But what happens when anxiety becomes constant and appears without a real threat? First, we need to understand that anxiety can be both a healthy response and a problem. When we talk about normal anxiety, we're referring to the feeling of nervousness before an important presentation, or the worry when facing a risky or changing situation. These reactions are natural and even necessary, as they help us stay alert and motivated. However, when anxiety crosses that healthy threshold, it can become something more destructive. Pathological anxiety, as it's known, is the kind that occurs without a clear or proportional reason to the situation. It can manifest as a constant sense of fear, an endless cycle of worry, or even debilitating physical symptoms like rapid heartbeat, shortness of breath, or trouble sleeping. The difference between normal and pathological anxiety isn't just in the intensity, but also in the frequency and the impact it has on daily life. Normal anxiety is temporary and resolves once the stressful situation passes. Pathological anxiety, on the other hand, can persist for weeks, months, or even years, seriously affecting a person's well-being and interfering with their performance at work, in relationships, and in mental health. Let's consider, for example, a moderately stressful situation, like anticipating a big event or change, such as delivering an important project at work. In this case, anxiety is normal and even helpful, as it motivates us to act with more focus and preparation. However, for someone who suffers from pathological anxiety, that same event might trigger excessive and persistent worry that goes far beyond what's necessary. The mind starts spinning around what-ifs, and the person may feel out of control, even when facing a simple day-to-day event. Now imagine how anxiety can manifest without any apparent reason. The person feels a heavy burden, but can't identify where that sensation is coming from. This could indicate that something in the unconscious is surfacing, something that hasn't been fully processed or resolved. And this is where psychoanalysis comes in, offering a way to explore the roots of that discomfort, often hidden in the deeper layers of the psyche. In many cases, people don't even realize that their anxious reactions are the reflection of an internal conflict, such as the unconscious desire to avoid responsibility, the fear of failure, or even the fear of something we don't yet fully understand. Psychoanalysis teaches us that the roots of anxiety can be linked to unresolved trauma, unconscious thought patterns, or even unrealistic expectations that we've internalized throughout life. Psychoanalysis, as proposed by Sigmund Freud, offers a deep view of how anxiety originates in the unconscious. For Freud, anxiety isn't just a reaction to external situations. It's a reflection of an internal conflict. The key to understanding anxiety, according to Freud, lies in understanding the role of the unconscious, where unprocessed or unresolved desires, fears, and traumas are hidden. Freud believed that the human psyche is composed of three main parts: the id, the ego, and the superego. Each of these parts plays a crucial role, and the balance between them is essential for our mental health. The id represents our primitive desires and instinctive impulses. The ego, in turn, is the rational part of the mind that tries to balance the demands of the id with external reality. The superego is the voice of morality, based on the internal norms and values we've learned throughout life. When the ego fails to balance the demands of the id and the superego, the resulting conflict can lead to anxiety. For example, the id might desire something that goes against the values of the superego, creating inner tension. When that tension is repressed or ignored, it manifests as anxiety. This process is often unconscious, meaning the person may not be aware of the source of their discomfort, but they feel its physical and emotional effects. Freud suggested that anxiety is the ego's response to this tension. When the ego feels threatened by the unconscious desires of the id or the rigid morality of the superego, it activates anxiety as a defense mechanism. This process helps prevent the person from directly confronting desires or feelings that are considered unacceptable or dangerous. A classic example of this is repression. When a person has a desire that's socially unacceptable, such as an aggressive or sexual impulse, the ego tries to block that desire to avoid suffering. However, by doing so, the ego creates inner pressure, which later manifests as symptoms of anxiety. This process of repression, while protective in the short term, can have harmful long-term effects because the repressed desires continue to exist in the unconscious, waiting for a chance to surface. Additionally, Freud identified the phenomenon of neurosis, which is closely linked to anxiety. For him, neuroses arise when the ego can't effectively manage the unconscious impulses of the id or the demands of the superego. The anxiety resulting from these situations can be so intense that the person begins to develop defense mechanisms such as projection, blaming others for their own feelings, or rationalization, finding logical explanations to justify behaviors that are actually repressed impulses. Neurotic anxiety, as Freud called it, is one of the most complex forms of anxiety. It's not related to a real external threat, but to an unresolved internal conflict. This type of anxiety can manifest in phobias, obsessions, compulsions, and other behaviors that seem to have no clear cause. In psychoanalysis, the idea is that these symptoms are a way for the ego to try to deal with repressed desires and fears, but unsuccessfully, resulting in continuous suffering. For example, someone who feels intense anxiety when entering an elevator might actually be dealing with an unconscious fear of being trapped or vulnerable. That fear may be linked to past experiences or to a sense of powerlessness that was never fully acknowledged or processed. In this case, the anxiety is a manifestation of an unresolved conflict in the unconscious. Finally, Freud believed that anxiety had a defensive function, protecting the ego from direct confrontations with repressed content from the unconscious. Although anxiety helps avoid immediate suffering, it can also become a trap as the person continues to be dominated by those internal conflicts without ever resolving them. Psychoanalysis, then, seeks to bring those repressed contents to the surface, allowing the individual to face them consciously and thus relieve anxiety in a lasting way. As we mentioned earlier, Freud identified three main types of anxiety, and understanding these types is essential to grasp how anxiety manifests in different ways within our psyche. Each type of anxiety has its roots in different unconscious processes, and often, their manifestations can be confused with other emotional issues. Let's explore each of these types of anxiety so we can better understand what's happening inside our minds when we feel anxious. Realistic anxiety occurs when there is a real and objective threat in the external environment, something that requires our immediate attention and an adaptive response. This type of anxiety is the natural response of our fight or flight system, which prepares the body and mind to face risky situations. For example, if you're walking down a deserted street at night and hear footsteps behind you, the fear of a possible assault activates realistic anxiety. In this case, anxiety is useful because it alerts us to immediate danger and prepares us to act, flee, or defend ourselves. Freud saw this type of anxiety as a healthy way to cope with dangerous situations, in which the emotional reaction is proportional to the actual danger. It is not related to internal conflicts or repressed desires, but rather an appropriate response to an external threat. Therefore, realistic anxiety is an adaptive emotion and essential to our survival, helping us react quickly to risky situations. Moral anxiety is a bit more complex. It arises when a person feels they are violating their own internal norms and values, or the expectations imposed by society and the culture they live in. This type of anxiety is linked to the superego, the part of the psyche responsible for moral and ethical principles. The superego is built on parental teachings, religious education, and cultural values that we internalize over time. When our actions conflict with these values, we feel deep guilt, shame, or unworthiness. For example, if a person commits a moral mistake, like lying or betraying someone's trust, they may experience an overwhelming sense of moral anxiety. This type of anxiety is fueled by internal pressure to meet the superego's expectations. Freud believed that when we fail to meet these expectations, the resulting conflict creates emotional tension that manifests as anxiety. Moral anxiety, then, is directly connected to our sense of right and wrong, and it often leads us to question our actions and values. This form of anxiety can become paralyzing, especially if the superego is extremely rigid, causing the person to feel unbearable pressure to behave perfectly at all times. Neurotic anxiety is the most complex and often most debilitating form of anxiety. It is not related to a real danger or a moral conflict, but to an internal conflict that happens on the unconscious level. Neurotic anxiety is a result of the ego's inability to deal with the ID's impulses, which represent our primitive and instinctive desires, or with the demands of the superego, which imposes strict rules on how we should behave. For example, a person may feel intense anxiety while trying to meet the expectations of their parents or society, even if those expectations are unrealistic or unreachable. This tension between unconscious impulses and internalized moral norms can result in compulsive behaviors or phobias, in which the person tries to control their repressed fears and desires in dysfunctional ways. Freud considered neurotic anxiety to be the product of a weak ego, or one that is unable to manage the internal pressures of the ID and the superego properly. When the ego fails to find a balance between the ID's desires and the superego's restrictions, neurotic anxiety appears in the form of psychological and behavioral symptoms such as obsessions, compulsions, phobias, or panic attacks. Neurotic anxiety is often irrational and doesn't have a clear external cause, but rather comes from deep, unresolved conflicts within the psyche. These unconscious conflicts manifest as irrational fears, such as fear of objects, people, or situations that in reality pose no threat. It's important to note that these fears are the ego's attempt to control repressed impulses, but instead of solving the issue, the person ends up creating new anxiety symptoms. But how do the different types of anxiety affect behavior? Now that we understand the 3 types of anxiety, we can see how each one affects behavior in different ways. Realistic anxiety being a reaction to an actual external threat, tends to be a healthy response that helps us protect ourselves and make quick decisions. Moral anxiety, although uncomfortable, can help us maintain a high ethical standard, though in excess, it can lead to a cycle of guilt and shame. Neurotic anxiety, meanwhile, is often the most harmful, as it is a response to unresolved internal conflicts that manifest in dysfunctional ways. Individuals who experience this type of anxiety may begin to develop behavior patterns to avoid or try to control the anxiety, such as procrastination, perfectionism, or even substance dependence. These behaviors are not solutions, but rather ways in which the ego tries to cope with internal pressure. That's why psychoanalysis seeks to bring these unconscious conflicts to the surface, helping the person understand their origins and, as a result, relieve anxiety in a lasting way. Now that we've explored the theory behind anxiety, let's look at how it shows up in everyday life. Anxiety is not an isolated emotion. It creeps into our lives in subtle and sometimes even invisible ways, affecting the way we think, react, and even interact with others. First, it's important to notice how anxiety can express itself physically. Many of us have felt that pounding in the chest, rapid breathing, or shortness of breath when we're stressed or anxious. These are typical physical symptoms of an anxious response. They happen because when we feel threatened, even if the danger is psychological and not physical, our body enters fight or flight mode. This process, developed throughout evolution, prepares the body to react quickly to threats by increasing heart rate, blood pressure, and adrenaline levels. But anxiety doesn't stop at physical symptoms. It also affects our mind. Excessive worry or catastrophic thinking is a common trait of anxiety. Often a small concern grows out of proportion until it consumes our thoughts. What if I fail? Or what if something bad happens? Are recurring thoughts for those who deal with anxiety, and these worries can easily take up a significant part of our day. This can create a constant feeling of being out of control, as if the mind is always racing to predict threats that, most of the time, never happen. Another important point is that anxiety can also be seen in our behavior. Avoiding situations is a common response to the discomfort of anxiety. For example, someone who fears social exposure might begin avoiding meetings with friends or co-workers. This behavior is the brain's attempt to escape the situation that causes discomfort, but by doing so, the person might actually intensify their anxiety, creating a vicious cycle of avoidance and escalation. Another example is procrastination. Anxiety can lead someone to avoid tasks, especially those perceived as challenging or high risk, like the fear of failing at an important project. Procrastination isn't just a matter of poor discipline. It's an anxious response, where the fear of not meeting expectations or making mistakes causes the person to postpone the task. Additionally, anxiety can deeply impact our relationships. Often, an anxious person's behavior can be misunderstood by others. For instance, someone who's constantly worried might appear distant or even irritable, which can affect their social and family interactions. In a relationship, anxiety might also show up as a constant fear of rejection or not being enough, leading to clingy behavior or a constant need for approval. In professional environments, anxiety can be triggered by the pressure to meet high standards, complete tasks perfectly, or meet tight deadlines. This can lead to underperformance, as instead of focusing on the task, the person becomes consumed by fears and overthinking. This constant tension can also harm productivity, leading to a cycle of procrastination and frustration. Lastly, anxiety often manifests silently as a lingering discomfort the person can't quite identify. It might feel like constant dissatisfaction or a non-stop need to distract oneself, like watching TV or scrolling through social media, to avoid facing inner unease. The problem is that by ignoring the source of anxiety, the person is simply postponing the confrontation with what's really bothering them. Now that we understand how anxiety manifests in everyday life, let's explore some effective strategies to better understand and manage it in a healthier way. Psychoanalysis offers a set of tools that help access unconscious conflicts and understand the deep roots of anxiety. Along with that, there are also practical approaches that can be integrated into treatment to help relieve symptoms in daily life. One of the most powerful tools in psychoanalysis is free association. This technique involves saying everything that comes to mind without censorship, without worrying about what's being said. The idea is to access the unconscious, allowing repressed thoughts and emotions to surface. When we are able to access these hidden thoughts and emotions, we can better understand the internal conflicts that are fueling our anxiety. This process allows the patient to become more aware of their own fears, desires, and frustrations, and by bringing them to light, we can begin to work toward resolving them. Another important method is dream interpretation, which was also developed by Freud. Dreams, according to Freud, are an expression of the unconscious. Often our deepest fears and desires show up during sleep as symbols or images that seem disconnected from our daily reality. Interpreting dreams can help us understand these symbols and give more clarity about what's really going on in our mind. When we can understand the meaning of our dreams, we can start identifying sources of anxiety that we might not have even known were there. In addition to psychoanalytic approaches, we can also adopt practical strategies for dealing with anxiety in everyday life. Relaxation techniques like deep breathing are extremely effective for relieving the physical symptoms of anxiety. When we're anxious, our body tends to stay in an alert state with shallow, fast breathing. Deep breathing helps activate the parasympathetic nervous system, which is responsible for calming us down. By practicing deep breathing consciously, we can lower our heart rate and reduce the feeling of panic that often comes with anxiety. Meditation is also a powerful practice for reducing anxiety. Mindfulness meditation teaches us to be present in the moment and observe our thoughts without identifying with them. By practicing mindfulness, we learn to view anxiety as a temporary phenomenon, something that passes and doesn't have to dominate our experience. This practice helps create a healthy distance between ourselves and our anxious thoughts, allowing for a more balanced response to stressful situations. Another practical approach that can help is self-awareness. Identifying thought patterns that feed anxiety is the first step to changing them. Many times, our anxiety is tied to automatic thoughts like, "What if I fail?" or "What if something bad happens?" These catastrophic thoughts feed the feeling that the worst is about to happen, which intensifies the anxiety. By learning to question these thoughts and replace them with more realistic ones, we can reduce the intensity of our anxiety. Finally, it's important to emphasize that seeking professional help is essential. Although these strategies can be very effective, they don't replace psychological support. Therapies such as psychoanalysis, or even more modern approaches like cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, can offer valuable guidance. In many cases, working with an experienced therapist allows for a deeper understanding of internal conflicts and provides a safe space to explore the root causes of anxiety. Throughout this video, we've explored what anxiety is, its unconscious roots, and how it manifests both physically and psychologically. We've seen how psychoanalysis, through Freud's theories, helps us understand the internal conflicts that generate anxiety, and how we can use techniques like free association and dream interpretation to access and begin resolving them. We also covered practical strategies that can help relieve the immediate symptoms of anxiety, like deep breathing, meditation, and conscious reflection on our thought patterns. Remember, understanding the origin of your anxiety is a fundamental step toward finding inner peace and emotional balance. Now, with this new understanding, you have the tools to begin dealing with your anxiety in a healthier way. If you need help, don't hesitate to seek support from a professional. Transformation begins with self-knowledge. Thank you for watching until the end. If you found this video helpful, share it with others who might also benefit from this information. Self-knowledge is the key to transformation, and everyone deserves that opportunity. Don't forget to check out the recommended video now on screen. Take the chance to explore more content from our channel and continue your journey of self-discovery.